Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randirhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
Mary had a little man.
The fall. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream today. Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Oh, every time I hear that, I get chills. Every time. And you know, every April 4th, we play some of that I've been to the mountaintop speech for you, because he delivered that 31 hours before he was assassinated, and it still gives me the chills 50 freaking years later, and the audio is getting better and better. People actually go on the internets and fix the audio, so whoever did that, thank you so much. 31 hours before he was assassinated, apparently he knew he was going to die. And the bravery, the courage, the succinctness of his message. A sniper, as you know, he was down in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King Jr. was in March of 1968. He had led a protest in support of the city striking sanitation workers, and there was violence after that March speech. And so the police obviously descended on the protesters, and they beat them with billy clubs and sprayed tear gas and sprayed them with mace. And so the next week, Dr. King returned to Memphis to get permission for another march. And he had been receiving so many death threats because he was advocating for the plight. It was economic justice. That was the message he was delivering. And it happened to be on behalf of black sanitation workers. But it was for all Americans. It was for every working class American to, experience a full day's wages for a full day's work, okay? And it was to have a living wage, which is still, his dream has not been fulfilled. But anyway, he went back down there. And, of course, after the March visit to Memphis, there was so many threats of violence against him. And so then on April 3rd, the night before he was assassinated, he gave the I've been to the mountaintop speech, where he told people that, I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. He knew. He said, like anybody, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. The next day, he's standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, and he had turned to grab his coat. And a sniper, to this day, they say it's James Earl Ray, but, some people believe it, some don't. But took a shot and blew his jaw off. Just blew his face off. It went in through the bottom of his chin from the building across the street. And Jesse Jackson was there, and Ralph Abernathy was there. He was the founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he ran to Martin Luther King's side. And by the time the ambulance took him to St. Joseph's Hospital, about 2 miles away, of course, he was dead, and that was just before dinner time. Now, they laid him to rest, just so you know. They laid him to rest on April 9th, 5 days later in 1968, and thousands gathered outside the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. They had a private ceremony for him, and Vice President Hubert Humphrey sat in the front row with Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, with Jacqueline Kennedy, with New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, with Harry Belafonte and Senator Edward Kennedy. 3 men who were running for president at the time were also there. That was Senator Eugene McCarthy, former Vice President Richard Nixon. Yes, Richard Nixon was at Martin Luther King's funeral. And Robert F. Kennedy was also at Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral. And Robert would be shot 2 months later. It was such a traumatic year, 1968. So whatever's happening to us now, just remember it ain't 1968 all over again. And that is the most amazing news. And here's an inside story from somebody who was actually at the funeral, and she was with the family and viewing the body the night before, and she was appalled at the work of the mortician to his skin. She said he looked like somebody grabbed a whole glob of red clay and slapped it across his face. We all wanted him to look good, look natural, look like himself. I eased over to the mortician and I asked if there was anything you can do to tone down the face. And the mortician said, the jaw was blown off. That's the best I could do. So she got desperate, and she mixed together face powder that she borrowed from Coretta Scott King and Julie Robinson, who was Harry Belafonte's wife. And she took their makeup and she mixed a brown and a white, and she created a sort of a foundation that was close to Dr. King's complexion. And with a handkerchief, she started to apply it, and she started to blend it in to make it look more like him. And she said it worked. So she applied the mixture two more times. One time at midnight before he was taken to the church, and the next morning before the private funeral. And just so you know, during his funeral, they played a recording of one of his signature speeches that you've probably never heard, called The Drum Major Instinct. And during that speech, Dr. King imagines, again, his own funeral. And it was recorded exactly 1 month before he was killed. So it should tell you that he totally knew that somebody was going to kill him, and he just kept going. In that drum major speech, he said, every now and then I think about my own death, and I think about my own funeral, and I don't think about it in a morbid sense. And every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I would want said? I'd like somebody to say that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that Martin Luther King tried to love somebody. Yes, if you want to say I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. So I would like to say that Dr. Martin Luther King was a drum major for justice. And I would like to say that he gave his life serving others, and that the legacy that he left was not just civil rights, and not just voting rights, and not just anti-Vietnam War, but it was an economic justice message. It was a message that said that men who work should not be poor. And that is still not realized in this country. That's still not a basic human right in this country. And that is what Dr. King stood for, an economic justice agenda for blacks, for whites, for Asians, for Jews. And I mean, you know, and of course, everybody's going to marginalize him as being the guy who, only did civil rights and only did the Voting Rights Act, which is a long haul because the Voting Rights Act has just been gutted. And look what's happened to our ability to vote. OK, but everything he did with regard to civil rights, everything he did with regard to the voting rights, that was just the first phase of his freedom movement. The second phase was economic equality, so that everyone in this country would have a decent, fair, livable wage. And this is the Democratic platform, the $15 an hour minimum wage. This is something we still fight for in this country. He was talking about health care. He was talking about education. He was talking about housing. He was talking about a freedom budget for every American. He was talking about unions being the backbone of freedom in this country. He was talking about a second New Deal. He was talking about what I talk about, that we need another FDR. He was talking about living wages back in 1968. He was talking about and when he participated in the garbage workers strike, please now notice that we're having a teacher strike in crazy red states, West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma. You're still having teachers, you're still having public service workers on the streets walking off their jobs trying to get a living wage. You got teachers who are moonlighting and doing landscaping on the side. And some of them say they make more money mowing lawns than they do teaching our kids, who are our future, as you can see with regard to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas anti-gun movement, who have a valid point. When you consider that the head of the nonviolent movement for economic justice, civil rights, voting rights, access to the ballot box was killed by a bullet, and that they watched 17 of their friends and teachers die by bullet. And yesterday at YouTube, some crazy girl who hates the policies of YouTube decided to go to YouTube and kill people. I mean, everything he stood for. If you can't remember what he stood for, just please go to RandiRhodes.com and look in the homework section. There's so many great articles about the people who remembered him, telling you the stories and what happened at his funeral and what his legacy really is and what he spent his life fighting for and why it was so dangerous to fight for a living wage in this country and why what was his what was the Poor People's Campaign? What were the 5 pillars of the Poor People's Campaign? What was the Economic Bill of Rights for all Americans? It was a meaningful job at a living wage. It was a secure and adequate income. It was access to capital. It was access to land. Especially for poor whites and minorities, it was the ability for ordinary people to play a truly significant role in government and not just, keep electing people who could raise the most money or whose parents were well connected, the dynasties of America. And his last-ditch effort was this garbage worker strike to save America from the evils of racism, poverty, and war. That's what Martin Luther King was. And this is why I say to you, if Jesus walked among us in modern day, someone would kill him. Someone would take him out. And he's been marginalized as an inconvenient hero. This man was fundamental to the conversations in this country that we still are having about economic and social change, about violence and unwanted war, unneeded war, the sacrifice of young men for no good cause. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And remember that the fight for economic justice and the fight for unwanted wars and wars that don't need to be, it's still going on. And so maybe if you look at his life, you might better understand the relevance of his legacy to all of us today. I do this every April 4th when a shot rang out in the Memphis sky. Because it just seems to me that as bad as things are today, it couldn't possibly be any worse than 1968 when 19-year-olds were being sacrificed at the altar of, beating back communism in Southeast Asia. When the people were fighting for a living wage for all Americans, when people were trying to bring some sort of justice to the country, making the arc of justice bend towards justice, closing the gap between the haves and the have-nots, getting involved in a labor movement again, getting involved in civil rights issues again. Can't get any worse than it was then. Can't get any worse. Go to RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.